Washington Journal continues.
Dr. Scott Gottlieb served as the 23rd Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, works now as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, joining us this morning to discuss the federal regulation of cannabidiol, CBD as it's better known as. Dr. Gottlieb, start by explaining what CBD is.
Well, CBD is a derivative from the cannabis plant. It's an oil, it's an extract. Previously, it was only available from the plant that you grow marijuana from the cannabis plant that you would grow marijuana from or derive marijuana from. But the 2018 Farm Bill legalized the growing of hemp, which is a form of cannabis that has low concentrations of THC, which is a psychoactive substance that causes the effects that you get from using marijuana. So now you're seeing hemp become a much more prominent agricultural crop. There's a lot of people in this country who want to grow hemp. It's a crop that can grow in poor quality soils, so you see it being grown in lower quality soils, colder climates. So it could be a real opportunity for American farmers to develop a new crop. It mostly has industrial purposes, but being able to derive CBD from hemp and market it, that's a high margin use of that crop. So there's a lot of farmers who are growing hemp who now want to put CBD into food products.
Market it for what purpose? What is CBD used for?
Well, right now it's only used under FDA regulation for one purpose. It's approved in a concentrated form for the treatment of certain seizure disorders, a drug called Epidiolex. But there's a lot of companies that want to put CBD into dietary supplements or food, but under the current law, the way the law is constructed right now, that's not legal. So all the CBD that we see on the market, and there's a lot of it, that's being put in pet food or different foods for human consumption or different dietary supplements, all of that's really illegal under current law. And so the question is, how do you define a regulatory pathway that can allow it to be safely put in those food products if that's what Congress intended for?
How are those products allowed to be on the market and available if they are illegal?
Well, FDA has taken enforcement actions, and when I was there as the commissioner, we took certain enforcement actions based on the claims that people were making about it. There were companies claiming that CBD can treat all kinds of medical conditions, and some claims were outlandish, like CBD can help in the treatment of certain cancers. But FDA could sweep those products off the market right now, and it has been taking selective enforcement actions. There's a lot of political debate and pressure from Capitol Hill to try to create a legal pathway for CBD to be allowed into food products right now. I think when Congress passed the 2018 Farm Bill, a lot of legislators thought they were creating a legal pathway for CBD to be allowed into food products, but they actually, in that bill, very explicitly preserved FDA's authorities.
We have a special line in this segment for those who use CBD. 202-748-8003 is that number if you want to join the conversation. Otherwise, phone lines as usual. Republicans 202-748-8001. Democrats 202-748-8000. Independents 202-748-8002. We have that special line. Maybe a bit of a dangerous question, but who's most likely to use CBD?
Well, a lot of people are using it. That's the bottom line. It's become popular, and I think, unfortunately, people are using it based on assumptions that they're going to derive some kind of therapeutic benefit that they're not going to derive. There's really no evidence for it. The places where CBD has demonstrated some potential medical applications is in certain neuromuscular disorders, potentially, based on some early literature. And again, it's only approved in the treatment of very rare seizure disorders, pediatric seizure disorders. So it's not to say that there won't be other uses, benefits proven for CBD, but right now there's only a narrow set of things where there's actually what I would call reliable science suggesting that there could be a potential benefit. One of the places you see a lot of people using it is in pet food. There is a presumption that if you feed your dog CBD before you go to work, when you come home, your dog's going to be more relaxed. There's absolutely no evidence to support that. I think it's a very hokey use of CBD. It's unfortunate, but actually the place where you see CBD being used on the widest margin, or the widest proportion, illegally again, is in pet foods.
You're concerned about risk. You talk about potential benefits, unproven benefits. Right. What are the risks?
Well, there are risks associated with it. I mean, the most obvious risk based on what's known about it scientifically is liver toxicity. So in concentrated forms, you can have liver toxicity. We have some evidence suggesting that in both animal studies and human reports. And there may be a cumulative effect. So if you have CBD for breakfast and CBD for lunch and CBD for dinner in different food substances, you could get a cumulative effect from CBD. It could build up in the body. And some of the formulations that I saw when I was at the agency were pretty concentrated forms. So when people would go online and buy CBD oil, they were getting pretty concentrated forms of CBD in some of these formulations. The other thing to keep in mind is that some of the CBD that's being sold has high concentrations of THC in it. So some people are getting varying amounts of the same, psychoactive substance found in marijuana in the CBD.
Give people a sense of how quickly this has become available and gotten to the marketplace. Is this all since that 2018 Farm Bill, or was it something that you saw a rise of when you were at the FDA before the Farm Bill?
Yeah, this has been building over a period of time, and a lot of the CBD that was being marketed was derived from the cannabis plant. What changed with the Farm Bill is the Farm Bill legalized low THC forms of cannabis, otherwise known as hemp, to be legally grown. And now that hemp is being legally grown in a high proportion in this country, and more farmers are going to be planting hemp, people want there to be a legal path to allow CBD to be put onto the market for companies that want to put it in food stuff. The challenge right now is that the people who are marketing CBD tend to be small companies and some irresponsible players. The legitimate food companies want to be able to put CBD into their products, but are holding back because they know it's illegal and they're waiting for a regulatory pathway. So what you don't want is an outcome where all the legitimate manufacturers are waiting on the sidelines, and what you have flooding the market are manufacturers, many of which are illegitimate. So I think it's important that we think about what a safe pathway can be, if in fact consumers and Congress want there to be a pathway. But you can't legally put into the food supply a product that wasn't previously in the food supply and is available as a drug. So you can't just sprinkle drugs into food, and that's what you would be doing if you put CBD wildly into the food supply.
I want to talk more about that regulatory pathway, but give you a chance to talk to callers as well. Dr. Scott Gottlieb left the FDA earlier this year, returned to the American Enterprise Institute, a resident fellow, wrote a recent column, appeared in the Washington Post about CBD and his concerns about it. Phone lines for CBD users, 202-748-8003. Otherwise, phone lines as usual, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. Davia is up first out of Huntsville, Alabama, uses CBD. Go ahead.
Good morning, Dr. Gottlieb.
Good morning.
So I wanted to challenge you because it sounds like you're only really talking about CBD in the food supply, and I'm actually recovering from my 18th surgery, and the head of the pain department at University of Alabama, Birmingham, highly recommends CBD as an alternative to opiates in pain treatment.
Right.
I'm very curious what are your thoughts on that? Because when we talk about CBD being hemp-derived or cannabis-derived, there are a lot of things in play with that, as well as just molecular structure, so sub and tetracannabinoids as well.
Right. So there's other active ingredients in the cannabis plant, certainly, and in CBD. CBD is available as a dietary supplement. Dietary supplements are actually regulated under food regulation, is subject to post-market regulation. So when we talk about, from a regulatory standpoint, when we talk about something being in a food supply, it's sort of interchangeable with it being available as a dietary supplement as well. The caller is probably referencing using CBD as a dietary supplement, which you can find things sold online as dietary supplements. Once again, I think that the data that's available in the scientific literature demonstrating uses of CBD as something that can be effective in the treatment of pain is slim. I don't think that there is really convincing data suggesting that CBD can be effective in that indication. I know a lot of people, a lot of patients are using it in that way, and they believe they're deriving a benefit. But if we want to try to make it available for that purpose, we should do proper studies and look at what the long-term benefits are as well as the long-term risks.
When was the first time there was a proper study about this, just to understand the time frame here of the scientific community trying to come to grips with this?
Well, there's multiple INDs open, meaning there's multiple studies underway for purposes of studying CBD and CBD derivatives for potential applications as a therapeutic. A lot of the studies that are underway look at CBD in the treatment of various neuromuscular disorders. There's some people who think CBD can be effective in things like Parkinson's potentially. You see that. There's also obviously people who think it could be effective in the treatment of pain. The only place where it's been demonstrated to be safe and effective for purposes of satisfying FDA's regulatory hurdle is in the treatment of these two seizure disorders, where it's available in a purified and concentrated form for the treatment of two very rare pediatric seizure disorders, and it's an effective drug in that indication.
Valerie's a CBD user out of New York. Good morning.
Good morning. I started using CBD about 6 weeks ago for pain in my back because I was desperate, and I discontinued it about a week ago. What I'd like you to comment on is there aren't really a lot of studies going on right now. And people, I mean, this is very common, but people in pain right now are so desperate. I've tried Kratom, and there is Cystolex. I was hoping there would be more studies with Cystolex, but so that's new and nothing's happened yet. Could you talk about that a little bit, please? And it's very expensive.
Yeah, I think the caller brings up a larger challenge, which is there's not a lot of non-opioid alternatives for the treatment of pain, particularly for the treatment of chronic pain. And so you see a lot of people who have chronic pain conditions become long-term users of opioids, which obviously has all kinds of risks and concerns associated with it. Kratom itself is a weak opioid. There are people who use it as a substitute for currently available prescription opioids, but it's a larger problem that we don't have effective non-opioid alternatives for the treatment of pain. And when we do have drugs that treat pain, there really hasn't been a free lunch in this space. Every single drug that's been approved for the treatment of pain, and particularly chronic pain, has had some kind of liability associated with it, either abuse liability or risks associated with long-term use of those drugs. So this is a space where I think we need more pharmaceutical development, more active research looking at some of these new compounds. And there's certainly reasons to believe that some of these active compounds could potentially be formulated in ways where they could have a therapeutic effect for the treatment of pain. But you want to be able to formulate them in ways that you're delivering a precise dose in a responsible concentration. You understand the side effects, and you understand the full scope of what the effectiveness can be. In treatment of pain, CBD just in the treatment of pain, that's someplace where there hasn't been a lot of literature. There's been studies, but there hasn't been a lot of convincing literature.
I know you left the FDA earlier this year, but how important is this issue on the realm of issues that the Trump FDA is dealing with right now?
Well, I could tell you, as I was leaving the FDA, when I was meeting on Capitol Hill, this came up in almost every conversation I had with members of Congress. And I testified twice in my last 2 weeks before Congress, once before the House and once before the Senate, and I had multiple questions on what the agency's approach was going to be to CBD, because there is a desire to see a legal pathway for CBD to be put into food products and dietary supplements, and it's emanating from the fact that farmers want to grow hemp, and in order to grow hemp profitably, this is a very high margin derivative from hemp, and so there's an expectation that they want at least a pathway forward. Right now there's no legal pathway to put it into the food supply. And what I outlined in the Washington Post was what I thought was sort of an interim steps FDA can take to allow it to be put into food products on a limited basis in a more responsible fashion right now, while you worked on that longer term pathway to get the data you need to properly define both the risks as well as what the potential benefits can be.
So for that process, what's the time horizon for that happening?
Well, the process that I outlined in the Washington Post could be immediate. So what the agency would do under what I laid out is put in place some expectations on what CBD would have to meet to be able to put into the food supply. So it'd have to have no very low concentrations of THC. It'd have to certify how it's manufactured. You'd have to make it available only in low concentrations. You'd have to have effective track and trace in the system to make sure the CBD is coming from a responsible source. It'd have to be in a purified form. FDA can say, okay, if it meets these conditions, we're going to, for now, exercise enforcement discretion, allow it to be put into the market, so long as companies are working towards filing applications, basically petitions with the FDA. And this is how it works on the food side of FDA's house. You file a new dietary ingredient application or a new food ingredient application, a petition, demonstrating that it can be safely used for that purpose, that you can safely put it into a food supply at a low concentration. So the onus would be on the manufacturers ultimately to get those petitions in. They'd have a certain date by which they have to do it, but in the interim, the agency could exercise what they call enforcement discretion, allow it to be used in those products so long as it meets certain conditions that sort of guarantee, not guarantee, but help assure its safe application.
Mary is in Ashburn, Virginia, Republican. Good morning.
Good morning, doctor.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. I just want to clarify that I am calling in about pets and CBD oil because I have no experience with people and CBD oil. But I do have a very small dog. She's about 12 pounds, and on any given day, she's your average normal small dog. But whenever there is fireworks going off somewhere or thunderstorms, she is a Woody Allen neurotic mess. And I have to admit, just like you, I was extremely skeptical about all the products on the market for dogs and pets who, suffer from anxiety, because there's just so many. But I did a little bit of research online, and I purchased some oil that, I thought, well, what the heck, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least I tried. And within an hour of her taking this oil, she doesn't even notice there are thunderstorms. And we've tried everything. We've tried those thunderstorm jackets, holding her, swaddling her like a newborn, and the oil actually works for her.
So there is a lot of CBD being put into pet food and being marketed for pet purposes. This is probably one of the biggest categories. It's become so pervasive that I think it's going to be hard to put the cat back in the bag, pardon the pun. There's not good evidence to support the use of the product in this way. And the other thing to keep in mind...
Are those studies being done? You said there's studies being done on the human food side.
There are not. I think that, ultimately maybe some of the literature on the human side can perhaps translate into some research on the animal side. I'm not privy to everything that's being done in the animal space, but I see far less literature.
Because that regulation doesn't have to come through FDA?
It does come through FDA. I mean, it would be regulated as an animal drug or an animal food, so it would have to come through FDA, and the regulatory pathway would look very similar. But I'm not aware of a lot of literature going on looking at its study in these applications. I'm sure there's some that I'm just not aware of. But it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the CBD that's on the market, and there's been some studies looking at this where people bought the CBD and tested it, a lot of it has high concentrations of THC in it. There's trace concentrations typically of THC in most CBD oil, but some of it has high concentrations of THC. So you could be sourcing CBD, giving it to a pet, observing a therapeutic, what you perceive as a therapeutic benefit, and that's because they're taking THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana. So they're having the same, effective response that they would be if they were using active marijuana.
Forks, Washington. George, Independent. Good morning.
Good morning. I appreciate your show. My comment on the CBD and the marijuana is, in high school, they taught me, I'm 64, how marijuana run you for life and messed your mind up. Washington State legalized it. And they talked about the carnage that would fall, the drug addicts, the accidents. Nothing's happened. I mean, it's went over real good, and the state's made millions, and we're not putting people in prison for it. I happen to have both knees that need changed. The war on opiates, they fed me Tylenol until my livers got damaged. 3,500 milligrams a day, 6 aspirin. Does the doctor have chronic pain? Has he tried CBD? I mean, I'm not a dope smoker, but I'm asking him that. Thank you, sir. And have
I appreciate the caller's questions and his concerns. Look, there's a difference, to pick up on one point the caller made, there's a difference between legalization of marijuana and decriminalization. I think, we can move towards decriminalization of marijuana, but the question of legalization, particularly for recreational use, is a separate question. There are studies that show that long-term use of marijuana affects executive function. There are studies that show that it affects short-term memory. I do think that we're conducting a very large and potentially unfortunate natural experiment in this country by making THC and marijuana so widely available, particularly seeing the rapid rise in youth use of THC. There are going to be long-term effects from that on developing brains, seeing so many kids now using THC because of the legalization of these products and the retraction of any stigma associated with the use of these products. So we could look at decriminalizing marijuana, and there are valid reasons why we ought to do that from a public policy standpoint. That discussion should be separate from legalization, particularly around recreational use.
To put a fine point on it, do you think marijuana should be decriminalized nationally?
My own personal view, I think two things. One, I think we ought to look at decriminalizing it. People are arrested for possession of marijuana and face sentences that are oftentimes in excess of what they would receive for offenses that I think are far more significant and serious. And so you do see too many people, I think, developing significant criminal records for small possession charges of marijuana. Now, so that's the discussion around decriminalization.
Is that a discussion you had with the White House when you were at the FDA?
No, because my domain was largely public health, and the discussion that I would typically get drawn into was a question around legalization, and particularly around the youth use of these products. And you saw states moving to decriminalize these products or legalize these products, excuse me, I have to watch my own lexicon, legalize these products in ways that were making them THC accessible to youth. And I have a lot of public health concerns around that. I do think ultimately we're going to have a federal reckoning around these questions, because you've seen so many states move forward with different laws, many of which I believe are far too permissive from a public health standpoint in terms of making THC available to young people and making it available too widely, that we're going to want to have a federal regime that probably standardizes this and maybe puts in place more stringent safeguards around keeping these kinds of products out of the hands of particularly kids, where you have the biggest public health concerns and the biggest concerns around long-term implications of THC use. I suspect we're a couple of political cycles away from doing that, not because of not because of a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is not necessarily a partisan political issue. I think it's just going to take the federal government more time to catch up to what's going on in the states.
Laura uses CBD, Rockville, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. I was calling in to say I had a hysterectomy in April, full, not laparoscopic, sliced open completely. After the second day I was released, I dumped the Vicodin and used CBD and medicinal marijuana completely for pain. No Vicodin at all.
Yeah, there's no question that, I've heard from patients, even in my former role, and even as I continue to write about these issues, I got a lot of emails after that Washington Post op-ed from patients who, report deriving therapeutic benefit, and oftentimes it is patients who are suffering from painful conditions. I don't discount those stories. When patients tell me things in terms of how they experienced certain medications, I believe patients. It's not clear whether it was the CBD or other things in the CBD, and that's part of the problem. The CBD that's being sold online, if you go online, you buy CBD oil from one of these online purveyors, it's not regulated, and you don't know what you're getting, and there are other substances in it, and we've been able to demonstrate that.
I wonder how surprised you are by this column. Kevin Murphy, CEO of a large cannabis operator. This was his column in Forbes. The headline, "For CBD, self-regulation is best." He writes, "I believe that as the CBD market continues to grow, there will be inherent checks and balances to ensure safety and quality, and I believe that Wall Street will have much to do with forcing that issue. Smart investors don't want to put their money into companies that overpromise and underdeliver when it comes to CBD. They will demand transparency from the companies that they invest in. No one will put money in a company offering specious claims about CBD curing cancer, because smart investors realize something like that can easily backfire and bring a company down."
Well, I'm not sure I would rely on Wall Street to be a public health regulator, quite frankly. It's probably true that reputable investors aren't going to invest in companies that are making absurd and illegal claims and promulgating products that are contaminated. There's due diligence that's applied, although I'm an investor now, I work with a venture capital firm. I wouldn't always put faith in due diligence to do all the things that a public health regulator would do, certainly. I think there's a lot of things FDA does, and does quite well, to help ensure safety for U.S. consumers. But the kinds of questions that you need to ask go beyond just the things that this writer talked about. You want to make sure that it's purified and potent. You want to make sure that there's evidence demonstrating that if you're making claims around it, people are going to derive that benefit. Because if you claim that CBD can treat Alzheimer's disease or can help stave off the progression of Alzheimer's disease or can treat cancer and have direct effects on tumors, which were some of the claims that we took enforcement action against, it's not just, if it doesn't deliver those benefits, it isn't just that the patient's not going to get the benefits that they hoped for and they thought were intended by the product, but they might forego other therapies that are proven to deliver those benefits. So if you're a cancer patient and you have one shot at potentially treating effectively or even curing a cancer, and you're deceived to believe that CBD is going to be effective for that purpose while there's other available therapy that has been proven to be effective for that purpose, you might forego that effective therapy. And that's a very big public health concern and was a touchstone for a lot of the enforcement actions we took based on some of the ridiculous claims that were being made about these products.
And should note those enforcement actions continue. It was just July 23rd that the FDA sent a warning letter to a company, Curaleaf, out of Wakefield, Massachusetts. Some of the claims they were concerned about: CBD effective in killing human breast cancer cells. CBD has been shown to be effective in treating Parkinson's disease. That was some of the claims that company was making.
And there's a lot of companies making claims like that, and we took actions when I was there. You know, I used to talk about, when I went before Congress, I talked about over-the-line claims. Those, in my view, are over-the-line claims. If you're claiming that CBD can help shrink tumors, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest it does, and there never will be. I can confidently say there never will be. If you're claiming that CBD can help in the treatment of seizures or maybe a neuromuscular ailment, well, there is some evidence to suggest that it might be effective for those purposes. So that becomes more difficult in terms of what you do on the enforcement side. But when companies are making these over-the-line claims where there's no evidence to suggest that there's any medical benefit at all, that's a place where the regulators, I think, need to be most stringent in stepping in and shutting that down.
I want to get you a few more calls before you have to run. Dave in Inverness, Florida, CBD user, good morning.
Morning. I tried the CBD for my aching bones. I'm 71 years old, but the reason I'm calling is doctor said the FDA is a guard dog for us here, but I disagree because they allowed, and they're continually allow, Roundup to be sprayed on wheat at harvest time, and we know what that causes: problems with your gut bacteria. Now it's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I know he wasn't around when Bush 1 deregulated Monsanto's Roundup, but look what it's doing now, and now they're getting sued. So I kind of, Doctor, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit older than you, but I've been following this for a long time. As a matter of fact, I think that you, C-SPAN, you had Dr. Stephanie Seneff from MIT who's doing research on Roundup on your program. And another guy named Dr. Bromer, I think he's from Germany, he showed the negative effects of killing gut bacteria in people, okay? So I don't know what you know about this stuff, but I don't think the FDA's been doing their job.
Well, the caller brings up two questions. There's two underlying questions. First is the regulation of Roundup. It's a weed killer regulated by EPA, so EPA regulates the product itself. The question of whether or not Roundup gets into food in trace amounts, a lot of that research has been done by FDA, looking at whether or not there's trace amounts of Roundup getting into certain foodstuffs. And there is some evidence to suggest that in certain foods you do see certain trace levels of the weed killers that are used on the weeds themselves. And then the question becomes, does it have a human effect? You know, the caller talks about effects on the gut microbiome. There's questions around whether or not it can have longer-term effects. The litigation he references is around whether or not Roundup is associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, long-term exposure to it. But the actual regulation and the questions around the safety of Roundup as a product are regulations that EPA administers. FDA's jurisdiction here, and their concerns would turn on the food itself. Is it getting in, and then what are the implications of that?
DeSoto, Kansas, Diane, Republican, good morning.
Good morning. I'm also a CBD user, and I also have a regulatory background with animal drugs. Anyhow, I use CBD oil. I want to first say 1 fluid ounce costs $100. If it's regulated as a, even going through the process of getting regulation even as a food, or GMPs or any of that, it will make it flat out cost prohibitive, in my opinion. But second of all, the one I use is what I'd almost consider a model for good labeling. The labeling is done with everything, lot number, expiration date, storage conditions, full list of ingredients, and it's listed as a dietary supplement, no drug claims. I mean, just all the stuff that you would normally want to see on something like this, except for one thing. It says that it is manufactured for this particular company, and it gives that address, but that's manufactured for. My biggest concern, knowing my background, is who made this. I would be most concerned about the company being reputable, not coming in from some foreign company where there's absolutely no regulations at all.
Diane, thanks for the question. Running out of time. Want to give Dr. Gottlieb a chance.
There's a lot of all dietary supplements are subject to GMPs, which is good manufacturing practices requirements, and so there's a lot of dietary supplements sold at price points that are very accessible to consumers. So simply the regulation, the GMP regulation itself, isn't going to necessarily raise the price exorbitantly in ways that this won't be accessible to consumers. The caller referenced the labeling. She said it had labeling as a dietary supplement and it had all this information on it. There's no reason to believe that any of that's true. Now, I have no reason to believe it's not true, but we just don't know. And that's the point of having a regulatory process. These are important things. Where is it manufactured? What is its purity? What is its potency? Are there other ingredients in it? Can you assure the safe custody of the product? Is it manufactured in a proper environment? If it needs to be sterile, is it sterile? The label can say that. Right now, there's nobody looking in to make sure that what's on the labels of any of these products is actually truthful and non-misleading.
Dr. Scott Gottlieb, the 23rd Commissioner of the FDA, currently a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You can check out his work there at aei.org. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.